Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Intercity Bus 101, State of the Industry, the first in a series of sessions that will bring to you everything you need to know about where Intercity Bus is at now and in the future. We have an esteemed slate of panelists. Just a little bit about housekeeping. Please stay muted if you're not a panelist. At the end, you will be told when it's time to be unmuted for questions, but we have a lot of great resources to go through, so you'll really learn a lot. Now, to kick off this meeting, I'm going to introduce Kai Manas, who is the Associate Director for the Institute for Transportation Research and Education for North Carolina State University. And he will start introducing the session and our first panelist. And if you have any questions during any part of the webinar, feel free to send them in through chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and questions directed to any of the panelists or anybody else will be answered after the presentation. So, ready for you, Kai.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, Kara. Thanks for helping us organize this webinar. As Kara mentioned, this meeting is okay. As Kara mentioned, this meeting is being recorded. I think we got some housekeeping issues going on here. Okay, so Kara, it says I can't share video, but I'm okay with that. So I'll just keep going. So the meeting is being recorded. This is Intercity Bus 101, and it's being brought to you today by the Intercity Bus Subcommittee of the Transportation Research Board's Rural Intercity Bus and Specialized Transportation Committee, otherwise known as AP 055, and in collaboration also with National RTAP, MTAP, and other industry experts. As Kara mentioned, my name is Kai Manas, and I'm with ITRI at NC State, and we work closely with NC DOT to administer the Intercity Bus contract in North Carolina. And I'm also the chair of AP 055's Intercity Bus Subcommittee. I'm really excited about the turnout that we have in registrations and the number of attendees today. I think it shows that there's a real thirst for the knowledge that we hope to bring you today. The intercity bus industry is experiencing rapid change. It really is unrecognizable from what it looked like just a few years ago. So today we plan to set the stage for understanding and responding to this change by providing a broad overview of the state of the industry. And our plan is to follow up today's session with more targeted specific topics that do a deep dive into things that you're interested in. So at the end of the webinar, we're going to ask you for your thoughts about research needs, topics for the next session, and some other items. In order to provide optimal forum for sharing all this information with people who are across the country, we do ask you keep your microphone muted. We are going to hold addressing all questions and comments until after all the presentations are complete. But feel free to use the chat to put in your questions. We'll go through the chat as they're coming in, and but there will be a time at the end to respond to the chats. And then once the questions and comments in the chat have been addressed, we'll have some prompting questions to hopefully have some time for a general discussion. But for now, I'd like to hand it over to Don Chartok, who will introduce himself. Don?
Yeah, thanks, Kai. As he mentioned, I'm Don Chartok. I'm with the Washington State Department of Transportation. With me here today is Nina Stocker, who is our Intercity Bus Program Manager. She's really the brains of the outfit. And in case anybody has any specific questions and technical questions, she'll probably be a better person to answer than I. So, and then the other thing I want to mention is I am also the chair of AASHTO's Transit Management Program, previously known as MTAP. It's essentially the state DOT transit managers from across the country. We talk about intercity bus all the time. So if you're looking for a set of peers to kind of work through some of these issues. I really encourage anyone who's not a member of the Transit Management Program, previously MTAP, to consider it. It's a really good place for to talk through a lot of this stuff with your peers, and I'm sure we'll be talking about Intercity Bus in the future. So I'll be talking a little bit about how Washington State runs our Intercity Bus program, and hand off to at least one other state, and then we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into some other topics. You know, I've, over the past couple of years, basically since the pandemic, I've talked to a lot of different states who maybe previously used to certify that all the intercity bus needs in their state have been met, but now they're beginning to realize that that may not be true if it was ever true. That more than ever, there are needs out there that we can use this funding to help us address. And so I have more slides than I have time today, but I thought I'd leave them here in the presentation that can be shared afterwards, and people can find out a little bit more information than our program, about our program, and follow up with either Nina or myself. One of the reasons we're talking here today is the world's different. And I think someone's already said it. The world's different than it was 5 years ago. And I think it's kind of sped up an issue that has been happening for a long time. Essentially, the intercity bus industry is going the same way as the other forms of public transportation. You know, there used to be a time when transit, ferry, rail was all unsubsidized in different cities and in counties and places across the United States. And slowly but surely, as the business model failed, we as communities decided that it was still worth investing in and still worth providing access for folks. And I think essentially one of the things that's starting to happen is that we are coming up in the same place for intercity bus. And I think most of the people on this call here today are folks who are interested in figuring out how the state, in this particular case, and with the help of FTA dollars, can help provide access to those folks who need it most. Kara, go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things that hasn't changed is the trend of need. We've seen rural populations across the country steadily become older and more isolated. And the whole goal of the Intercity Bus program is try to address some of that, help those folks who live in rural areas have access to the network, get people from the rural areas to the network or urban areas where the goods and services are. Next slide. And actually go ahead and skip one more. So those are the names of our different routes. And here, I like this map a lot because it shows the network. You know, that to me, that's the key of what Intercity Bus is about. As I assume is true in many other states, our main unsubsidized service goes along the interstates. And for us, that's I-5 and I-90. I-5 goes north and south, and I-90 goes east and west. And it's that blue color that you see on the map. You know, remember that the goal of Intercity Bus isn't to get to the next town over, it's to create that connection. So in the bottom southeast corner, you see Walla Walla there. And so the point is not to get from Walla Walla to that next town of Pasco. The point is to get from Walla Walla to Seattle, or even all the way to Miami. Get in the network, be able to go. One of the things that's happened in Washington State is that our major east-west interstate I-90, the service hasn't come all the way back. And so we're currently getting ready to launch a new study about those needs on the east side of the state and how we get around and how maybe our state should invest a little bit differently. In the before COVID times, this whole network was timed meaningful connections. And so that you were able to make that trip, that multi-leg trip that I just described. And so now we're looking to get back there, and that probably is going to mean some additional investment on our part. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Just this one just kind of speaks for itself. Our network itself hits most of the places that need the service. And so in 2019, when we did our last study, we were actually kind of trying to chip away at that, that 95% within 25 miles. That's a pretty good number, and wanted to get better and better. Now I think our goal is going to be kind of to shore up those meaningful connections. Go ahead and go to the next slide. It's a little bit of our history of starting up, and let's go on to the next slide. And to me, this is key. Washington State used to manage our program, our Intercity Bus program, as a grant program, meaning that we were essentially relied on the Intercity Bus providers to come to us and say, oh yeah, I'm interested in running this route. And we might consider that, and on the merits of that individual grant application. However, we found that to be highly problematic, again, based on this idea of the network. We have an interest in the network succeeding, not just on that single route. And so one of the things that we've done is gone from a grant-making role to a contracting role. We do a plan and a study and say, where's the need? Where's the unmet need? Where's there a vacuum in service? This is a key word in the intercity bus industry, consultation. We'll identify the different intercity bus providers out there, make sure we work with them in setting up the system. And you know what? That we talk about consultation a lot in intercity bus, but frankly, it shouldn't be different than the rest of your grant programs, where you're meeting with your local folks and trying to understand what their needs are. Again, I say you, I'm referring to my peers, the states decide where the need is and where the service needs to be. And I just think that is key. So you do your plan, you design your network, and you put out the different routes that you want to connect to the network out to bid. And then we've had a lot of success doing that. Let's go on to the next slide. Branding and marketing in Washington State. We kind of create some standards. We require everyone to brand along our Travel Washington brand, and also interline with each other. Let's go on to this next one. Looking for the in-kind match. Let's go to the next one. There we go. Let's talk match. So one of the things I've heard from many of my partners across the country is, hey, it's great that the federal government is giving us all this extra money through the IIJ, but I simply don't have the match to spend it all. Guess what? Intercity Bus has this unique in-kind match scenario that they allow you to do. This comes from a creative argument that we in Washington, along with one of our old contributors, Robin Phillips, made many years ago, that we said to FTA, if you accept the whole point of Intercity Bus, again, is not to get from Walla Walla to the next town over, but to get to some other city somewhere else, you should be able to count that unsubsidized service as part of the project, and therefore count it as match. And FTA bought it. And now it provides specific guidance on how to determine what that match is. There's a whole section in the 5311 circular that shows all the different ways. But frankly, what it comes down to is getting a letter from whoever that Intercity Bus unsubsidized provider is that you are providing a connection with, and them telling you, the value. The other thing that we're doing in Washington State is we're starting to use toll credits as match. And so between these two different programs, is really a good way for us to start to draw down more of the federal money while not having to use state money as match or some other local form of match. Let's go on to the next state of the program. Thank you. So, here's some of the stuff I've talked about a little bit, and I think I'll hold off. We've spent most of our, or at least awarded most of our recovery funds. We're seeing different levels of recovery, but let's go on to the next slide, and you can see the graph. One of the things I love about this graph is it shows that our ridership is inching back up. But you know what? The ridership is inching back up, and there is less buses on the road right now. So to me, that more than anything demonstrates that the need is still there. So we saw this dip in ridership, but at the same time, following the pandemic, at the same time, it's going up, even though there's technically less service on the road than there was in 2019. So I think that's really key to making the point that the need is there. Let's go on to the next slide. So with that less service being provided, we're facing challenges of making sure those connections are meaningful connections. And so that'll be one of the main key things that we address in our new upcoming study. Issues around capital assets, which I think folks are going to talk about a little bit more in the future in terms of making sure that there's places for buses to stop. We need an increased investment. Make sure we need to coordinate between everyone. We've done a lot of work here in Washington between the transit agencies who have a lot of transit centers and availability to make connections, and we need to make sure that we're all being good partners with each other. Interlining agreements is key. It makes it so much easier for the riding public to be able to connect through multiple modes. And consider, again, the different kinds of match that is available. Go ahead. Looking forward, we're doing a new study. We're looking at expansion on the east side of the state. Let's see. We're continuing to increase. Yeah, no, I think this is all stuff that we've seen before. Again, we want to kind of wait. We don't want to wait. And we can't wait for everybody to the private sector to sort itself out. It's time for increased investment right now. And that's one of the things that we're going to continue to work on. And I think that brings us to our last slide, which is a connection to Nina. Again, Nina is our subject matter expert. Both of us will be on the line for questions at the end. Again, put your questions in the chat. And with that, I'll hand over to Jonah.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, Don. That was really interesting. I feel like I'm going to cover some of the same themes that Don discussed, but I'll be talking about North Carolina's intercity bus service and how we have sort of changed and adjusted over the years to meet those trends that Don was discussing and Kai mentioned as well. So I'm going to start off with a map just for all of you cartography folks out there. I'm a GIS major, so there's going to be a lot of maps. But this is just your North Carolina geography and how our intercity bus service is spread out across the state. Next slide. So again, my name is Jonah Friedman. I'm with the Institute for Transportation Research and Education at NC State University. We are sort of the research arm of NCDOT's, North Carolina's Department of Transportation's Integrated Mobility Division. That includes their bike ped and public transportation groups. And I'll have this contact slide at the end of the presentation as well, if you want to document. Next slide. So I just thought this is an interesting visual to look at. This is the Southeastern Intercity Bus Service in 1976. This is actually in our ITRI archives from our previous program manager. But this is a representation of just all of the mom and pop providers that were functioning in the Southeast and were profitable at the time, and how they circulated and spread across the Southeast, making all these different connections. It's just a really interesting map. And next slide. And this is our intercity bus service in the Southeast in 2023. Yeah, vehicle load pre and post pandemic, interesting. Yeah, so this kind of shows how North Carolina is very much part of a national network. We are a central I-95 state, and so that makes us a key linkage in the East Coast ICB network. And we really do function for FTA as a connector between a lot of different services throughout the Southeast. And this image is from the Intercity Bus Atlas, so you can find that link if you download these slides. And next slide. So this is just a juxtaposed image, a side-by-side comparison to show the contrast between 76 and 23, both in the service provided and the technology to display it. Next slide. So a little bit about what we do as the research arm of NCDOT. Specifically in the intercity bus arena, we conducted a needs assessment for NCDOT, and part of that is a stakeholder survey where we engage many stakeholders across the state and outside of the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we also issue and manage the call for applications. So we'll write up the application and contact providers to be part of our consultative process meeting. We track performance and expenditures throughout the life of the contract, getting all that data and compiling it into our internal database. And we address issues with stop locations. So when transit agencies have issues with where the intercity bus stops are or specific timing schedules, we work with the providers and the transit agencies as an intermediary, and we address those issues. So we have biannual contracts in North Carolina. Year one is for our needs assessment information gathering process and engaging with local transit agencies. And then year two, we put together that application and work with providers to get proposals. And as part of that, we are proposing specific routes that we would like these providers to be bidding on. And they provide us with proposals, and we go back and forth about how we would like to see those adjust. But and then finally, we assess performance year over year against previous contract years, and we have a database going back, I think, to the 90s. Some of it's in binders, but we do have a collection of all that data. Next slide. So as part of our planning process, we conducted a visioning workshop at the North Carolina Public Transportation Association conference in 2017. And this was a visioning workshop to sort of get all of our transit agencies and our stakeholders and our state DOT representatives and staff involved in the intercity bus planning process and get their perspectives on how North Carolina intercity bus service could better provide mobility and access to all of our citizens and our residents, and really enhance the service that we had in place at the time. So this is just one of the example maps that a group created during that visioning workshop. Next slide. And so this helped us develop what is now our intercity bus vision for the future, how we're going to improve service and expand service in the state, and what we'd like to see from our intercity bus network. And that's frequent, high quality, accessible service that connects our rural communities to opportunity in urban and rural areas. So really providing that mobility, providing that access that is essential to a 5311F program, an intercity bus network. And that means feeder service to our existing carrier routes. We want to really serve those trunk routes and provide as much ridership to those routes as possible, encouraging coordination between rural transit agencies to provide that intercity connectivity. And that's building routes that pass between multiple transit agencies, and they're coordinating together to make those services happen. And we want meaningful connections in these intercity bus network stops. We really want these services to be accessible and functional for our residents, and particularly for our rural residents, because the access can be very limited in parts of North Carolina, and that is our charters to address that need. We also want to build service around multimodal centers. We've got some new multimodal centers being constructed in the state, and we want to make sure that our intercity bus network is stopping at those centers. And of course, support network connections outside of the state. Next slide. So this is the vision sort of visualized in a map. I told you there'd be a lot of maps, so I'm staying true to that promise. So this is how these feeder services will sort of flow into our trunk routes, and those local transit agencies will build into these larger network trunk routes, and really provide the ridership that will keep them operating. So the unsubsidized services are in red, and our subsidized services have these blue arrows. And we don't envision the feeder service as ICB. These are connections through, again, local transit agencies. Next slide. So something unique about North Carolina is that we have a concept program. This is a grant funded just by the state for consolidation and coordination of public transportation. So this is encouraging agencies to, if not consolidate, then to coordinate their services and provide connections that will meet these intercity bus stops and connect them to the larger interstate network. And so we have 104 transit agencies. As much consolidation as can happen is helpful in administrating all of that service. But we have had a couple of agencies coordinate. We have two concept routes, the Down East Express and the Ridge Runner, and they are sort of uniquely placed on the east and west sides of the state to serve those less populated regions. Next slide. But of course, the majority of our funding comes from 5311 funding. And so what we do is highlighted in blue here, and what we don't do is in red. What we plan to do is in green. So of course, we have funding for planning, marketing, and operating assistance. We coordinate with our rural agencies through the consultative process meeting and the stakeholder surveys. And then we, of course, get quite a bit of in-kind match. So we get 10.8 million on this last contract from in-kind match. And that amount enables us to require no state funds incorporated in those routes. So those eligible services are all in-kind match and federal funding. And that really leverages that private capital to access federal funds and enables the state to reserve those funds for other initiatives, other programs. Next slide. So a little bit about our needs assessment. We do a needs assessment every 2 years again, and that needs assessment is intended to gather input from our stakeholders on our current service and get some feedback on how those services are functioning in the local communities, and potentially propose new routes. Some of the needs assessment requires sort of sifting through proposals that will not satisfy FTA's requirements in 5311F. But there are some excellent proposals in there as well that we bring to our providers when we do that consultative process meeting. So we also gather input on schedule changes, and in the past, we have not had enough intercity bus service to require that 15% of your 5311 funding. And so we've gotten a governor's certification, but we are actually in the first year, first contract period, where we have not required a governor's certification because we have spent all of our 15% 5311 funding on serving intercity bus. So we expect to continue completing a needs assessment because we do get excellent feedback and we do get interesting proposals from our stakeholders. And we're actually in the process of starting our next stakeholder engagement process. Next slide. So the stakeholder survey is distributed to 100 counties. So that's all the county managers. And again, that 104 transit agencies all receive this survey, our MPOs and RPOs and intercity bus providers, as well as some advocacy groups in the state. And it's interesting to note that every service that operates in the state now began as a proposal from a stakeholder. So these really have informed our process and have really built out our intercity bus network as it stands today. Next slide. So as we've been discussing, and as Don mentioned, it's really the last 5 years, we've seen so much change in our industry, and North Carolina has certainly followed that trend. This is our service structure in 2017 and 18. And you can see that there's fairly good coverage, but sort of gaps in mobility in the eastern part of the state, and with some significant holes in coverage in the central region. And there's some duplicative service from Raleigh to Wilmington, and then lots of transfers to access various parts of the state. So historically, all these eastern routes were served by private providers, but when they became unprofitable, the state came in to subsidize their continued operation. And the western part of the state never had service, so there were no routes to renew through a subsidy. So next slide. Back one. Back one more. There you go. Okay, so this is the GK Butterfield Transportation Center in Greenville, North Carolina. And this facility is really a great example of how one facility can change the whole dynamic of access and mobility for a region. Not only did it amplify the revitalization efforts in downtown Greenville through a bunch of employment opportunities and access to education, recreation, entertainment, but it really provided that central hub that we needed in the eastern part of the state for our intercity bus network to thrive and expand. It connects that 5 different transit organizations. So like the Pitt Area Transit, ECU, the local University Greenville Area Transit, the Greyhound, Amtrak, and all of the taxis all flow through this transit center. And it also provided an opportunity for a north to south connection running all the way up and down the state. So next slide. So the picture of the transit center is supposed to be where Greenville is, but you can see Greenville sort of central in the eastern part of the map there. So this is where we started. Next slide. And this is our intercity bus network now. As you can see, we really expanded service on the East Coast. We have numerous new routes since 2017. But to address that central part of the state really lacking any service, we have 2 new routes, the Asheville to Raleigh via Hickory route and the Winston-Salem to Fayetteville route that's in that sort of brown color through the central part of the state. And we've made a lot of adjustments and updates and improvements to all of our transfers through the eastern part of the state, all of our connections, and really made a lot of services more convenient that were difficult for certain residents to access. And this is the most complete intercity bus service that we've had as a state. This coverage is beyond anything we've had prior. And again, we expended the full 15% of our 5311 funds on this intercity bus network. Next slide. So, oh, I think we went. Okay, so yeah, this is just a illustration of the coverage across the state, and some new things. We have a GTFS feed from all our providers, and we're working on getting all of those feeds published to Google Maps on a consistent basis. And it's really impressive how much progress we've made in such a short amount of time. And it really speaks to that trend that we're seeing across the industry and just so much growth and expansion. Next slide. So again, this is just the private services, the unsubsidized services, as well as the subsidized services across the state. And there are other providers, but they are not in any way contracted with NCDOT. So we don't really necessarily know where they're going to be on this map. But there's also Amtrak and other out-of-county services provided by local transit agencies. So this is where our intercity bus network stands now after years of work and coordination and interaction with our providers and our agencies and stakeholders. So that's what I have. Next slide. I've got my information and Kai's information posted here. If you're interested and have any questions for us, I see there's a bunch in the chat, but I guess we'll address those later. And I'll pass it off to Fred, who's going to give a more national state of the industry view. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. That was very interesting because I actually started working on intercity bus when I was in North Carolina in graduate school, and did what might be the first state intercity bus plan out there, whatever. Sometime I'll have to share it with you. There was actually a time when, before deregulation, when the state had a very dense map. You showed the 1976 map. It was even more than that. Anyway, what I wanted to do today is just spend a few minutes giving everybody kind of the context that we're operating in now. And basically, the intercity bus industry, the unsubsidized part of it, the 95% of it that's doesn't really receive any federal funding, is in a period of profound change. And that is really a key point that's going to affect how states work with the carriers, how the carriers are working with each other, and how we can go forward using the resources that we've got to really maintain and develop the national network. And a lot of us are kind of really fixated on the network because that's really the thing that allows people to get beyond their local area and make trips that they need. And it was really demonstrated to me a couple of years back in Maryland when I persuaded Greyhound to give me some data that showed where the people who were riding Maryland's 5311F routes were coming from on the network. And I was just stunned to see that buses that were operating between Small towns in Maryland were carrying people who'd started their trips in California or Florida or New England. And it really brought home that this really was, even this little link in Maryland was part of the national network. At any rate, Kara, if you could move to the next slide. I just want to go back because I think a lot of the change that we're seeing now certainly really begins with the impact of COVID-19. And those of you who are in transit and those of you that are intercity bus providers, you know that ridership just, 43 states had stay-at-home orders. Many of the other states certainly encouraged people to stay at home. Travel just dropped off. In the intercity bus industry, depending on which carrier you talk to, ridership was down to 10, 20% of pre-COVID during 2020. And of course, the revenue from operating the services dropped to the same way. But for the intercity bus industry, since most of it's unsubsidized, the loss of that revenue was really, really difficult, very critical. The carriers basically cut services way back to just try and maintain the network correct connections. And federal funding, there was the CARES Act and ARPA and ARP, and eventually there was CRISA, but the federal funding for intercity bus was very limited compared to the 5311 program. And basically states were required to do a 5311F consultation to determine maybe how the intercity carriers could be supported with 5311F funding. And there was really a heroic effort on the part of carriers and states to keep the network alive using that mechanism. But it was some states really just couldn't see that they should use this money to support the network that had previously been unsubsidized. It was a very difficult situation, but it had continuing impacts. And if you contrast it to the way funding was provided to the airline industry and at Amtrak, they got direct federal funding in significant dollar amounts. I don't want to get into the dollars particularly, but it really allowed them to retain a lot of their capacity and their staff. And it left them, with a lot better ability to ramp up in the post-pandemic era. And when revenge travel happened, I don't know if you've been flying recently, but everybody is flying and everybody is yelling at the airlines because they didn't bring back all of their capacity, but they certainly had a lot of it, and they've been able to accommodate a lot of that ridership. And Amtrak is certainly carrying people. One of our staff members here took the train from Vermont day before yesterday. He said the train was completely sold out. So people are traveling. Now, are they traveling on the bus? Kara, if you want to show the next slide. One of the things that we have is there's demand for intercity bus travel. That's really recovered to a large extent. I can't give you numbers because we don't have any federal requirement for collecting intercity bus ridership, and different companies, they keep their own records. But what I have heard talking to people across the industry and also with transit operators is that because of the difficulty in bringing back qualified CDL drivers and getting the equipment, new equipment particularly, the capacity is not back. And we have, we're having difficulties getting enough service out there to serve all this demand. So anyway, one of the things that means is that on much of the network across the country, the frequencies are much lower than they were before COVID. Buses are full, but there are not nearly as many of them. And so for users, this means, there's fewer options for travel and connections are more difficult. And it means for states or other people that are planning around making those connections, there's many fewer potential connections to the national network. And I think Don alluded to this when he was talking about needing another way to get the equivalent of in-kind match by looking at toll credits to get that match and bring back some of these services, that there just is not there aren't as many opportunities to provide a good connecting service schedule with unsubsidized intercity bus service. So if you're not putting as many buses out on the road, that still constrains the revenue. And so the industry is still in a situation where the money to just expand things or invest in things is still tight. At least that's what I hear. Now, we have people on the call that I'm sure can respond and either second that or tell me that I'm 6 months behind the industry, but that's basically kind of the situation that we're in. Kara, you want to go on to the next slide? So one of the things that has made a significant difference coming out of COVID, after COVID, Flix Mobility, which is probably the planet's largest bus company at this point, purchased Greyhound. And there's a background to this, and I'm sure that COVID had something to do with the previous owners deciding they wanted to sell. But part of the sale was that Flix didn't get the real estate, and that's been a major issue. All of those intercity bus stations, bus garages that Greyhound owned and that were places that people could make connections were not part of the deal. And that's, we'll get to that in a minute. But of course, the other thing is that these two companies, combining them is a very challenging and interesting process. And I think we're all kind of waiting to see how it comes out. FlixBus is a company that does the planning, the marketing, the ticketing, the oversight and management of passenger services, but it contracts for all of the bus operations. And its model in the past has always used curbside stops. And basically the services were designed to be point to point, big city to big city, suburb to big city, university town to university town, with limited stops in between. Greyhound's model has always been owning and operating the buses, the passenger facilities, the garages, and it's operated as a network with lots of connections built into its overall system. And as part of that, in places that it didn't serve, it had interline connectivity with a lot of other carriers, which basically we've tended to sort of regard as the basis of the National Intercity Bus Network. So it's an effort to combine these models going forward. And so we see a lot of change in the industry. Next slide. So one of the early impacts of this purchase has been combining the ticketing systems. And this really went online in February of 2023. The ticketing system now, if you go to Greyhound or FlixBus, it shows both kinds of routes and services. It also shows interline partners. In the FlixBus, there's even some interline partners that are not branded as FlixBus that are included, such as Salt Lake Express. There's new ticketing options. You can get seat reservations. You can get your choice of seats. There's some tighter baggage restrictions. So there's a new environment online. And of course, bringing all of these services and the interline partners into one ticketing system, one information system, there have been some glitches. And sometimes if you go looking for a particular service, you'll kind of scratch your head and say, they're quoting me a really odd trip there. I think they're working on ironing these things out, and that's been coming along. And frankly, I've been impressed at the success that they've had in really maintaining the ticketing system. But basically, the impact of it is, if you remember the days when you just took your cash out of your pocket and walked up to what the Greyhound stop was and pulled it out and bought a ticket and went somewhere, basically the system is all reserved now. You have to get a seat reservation. You can, pay for it different ways, but the old days of the walk-up bus service are basically finished at this point. Everybody, people have cell phones, they make a seat reservation, and the bus company knows where they're getting on and where they're getting off. And so capacity management is an entirely different game from what it was before. I'm old enough, I can remember when every Greyhound station kept 2 or 3 spare coaches around just to deal with the need for second sections, because nobody knew how many people were going to turn up and ride. And anyway, it's a different world entirely. Kara, the next slide. The other part of it, though, that we're hearing a lot more about now is about the loss of stations. And what happened? Flixbus did not purchase the real estate. I don't think First Transit, the first group, actually offered to sell it. They kept the real estate. And now they've sold it to real estate companies. And one of the impacts of that is suddenly bus stations are having to move, often on short notice. And there's an entire drama unfolding, and I'm going to turn it over to Joe Schriederman, who will really bring us up to date on the status of bus stations.
Thank you, Fred.
So Joe, you take it away, and then we'll come back to where I dropped off there, Kara. So
It's really good.
We're making it tough on Kara here by switching out, but
Really good segue there. And I'm just going to offer a little color commentary for a few minutes with a few slides about the problem posed by the closure of traditional Greyhound stations. And I, like Fred, have been watching the industry since, pre-deregulation in '82. And I'm in downtown Chicago. We're running a small academic center called the Chaddick Institute that keeps tabs on the industry. And I'm one of the few academics that tries to look at the national intercity bus system. And we put out a newsletter, and we have an annual report called the Outlook for Intercity Bus Services. There's the cover of the one that came out just a few months ago. And we sorted by region to talk about what's happening in the sector. And go to the next slide. One of the predictions we made, which wasn't really sticking our neck out, but it was a concern, was that this year, 2023, we're going to see more legacy bus lines, Greyhound, Trailways, the traditional networked carriers, be involuntarily forced to relocate from traditional stations. And that's, really putting pressure on, the people on this call, state and local governments, to find safe and comfortable places for passengers. I think we heard from our North Carolina speaker, a kind of a success story in Greenville, North Carolina, which is the kind of leadership that everybody's looking for here. And I've been raising the red flag on this because it really is a unappreciated crisis, you might say. And go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of these are some traditional bus stations that have been lost. I'll describe them in a minute, but the qualities of these stations are: you have indoor waiting, climate control, a place to sit. Buses are brought off street. There's restrooms. There's sort of an identity to bus services that are prominent, signage out front. And there's a lot of models. It doesn't need to be a dedicated bus station. Intermodal stations are always really effective as well. But we'll see here what's happened due to the loss is some really less than acceptable station locations. So to give you a sense of why this is happening, it really began a number of years ago. Next slide, please. That some of the stations were oversized for what the level of traffic was. So we saw some stations be lost well before the pandemic. Portland is a good example of that, Portland, Oregon. But what really kicked this into high gear was last September. First Group, the previous owner of Greyhound, sold the stations to an outfit linked with 20 Lake Holdings Management, a real estate holding company, as a single transaction. And virtually every privately owned Greyhound station owned by First Group went with that transaction. And there appears to have been maybe a couple of years. This didn't happen until close to a year after Greyhound sold First Group sold Greyhound. But now that it's happened, the real estate company is gradually selling off the stations. And a lot of local governments, this has set off alarm bells. Some have taken action, some have blindly ignored the problem until we have a real mess. And I'm working with some people here in Chicago about the risk of our station here. Go to the next slide. But essentially what's happened is if you just look back in the last 2 years, mostly this year, Cincinnati station's been closed, which was a traditional station. Columbus was a recent example, and now Greyhound's on its second location after it had to move out of its legacy station. Knoxville, Tennessee, Louisville, Los Angeles, North Little Rock, and Tampa have seen their stations closed. And there's been press coverage about the possible loss of these other stations: Chicago, Cleveland, Dallas, Houston, Kansas City, Nashville, Orlando, Richmond. And there's quite a few smaller stations as well. And so we have done at the Chaddick Institute is try to get a handle on which cities have taken action, which states have been involved in solutions. And just to give you a sense of the stakes that are associated with this problem, go to the next slide, if you would, is, when things don't go well, it really presents a problem, and it sets the whole system back: subsidized, unsubsidized, intermodal connections. Cincinnati credit Greyhound and Barron's Bus for responding by creating a temporary station out closer to the edge of town. You see at the upper left, indoor waiting room, but not even close to being comparable to the previous station, and a transit inaccessible location there, which leaves a fair amount to be desired. Tampa, you see at the bottom left there, this is a press coverage when their station was closed, sold by 20 Lakes Holdings. They moved to a storefront ticket arrangement with curbside pickup. That's had challenges. Most recently is Philadelphia, where Greyhound, the station was sold for a new 76ers, reportedly a station for the NBA. And so we have a tough situation there. The Greyhound's looking for a long-term solution. And the reason that we think that this is setting the stage for local and state leadership is we have successful models out there. I feature one in our last newsletter, Fort Wayne, Indiana, where Greyhound or Barron's Bus, has moved to the transit center. Up and down the East Coast, we have success stories at Boston South Station, Washington Union Station, of course, the Port Authority Terminal in New York. So there's a lot of opportunities to create win-win situations by bringing bus intermodal terminals or dedicated stations that state and local governments manage. But there's been major roadblocks to that. One is federal legislation, which supposedly requires transit centers to offer access to intercity bus lines as part of a federal rule, doesn't stipulate the costs or the arrangements. So a lot of times Greyhound and other lines will approach a transit operator and the demands they place prove unacceptable. You need to have a full-time security officer, or you need to pay this much per month, or pay us to allocated cost of facility. And so we're finding that when these stations close, this often creates a really tough transitional situation. So that was my last slide. Go on to the next, if you would. Just want to say I'd love to stay in touch about this. If you are interested in sending me updates about what you're doing in your state, if you'd like to join our e-newsletter, which comes out 5 or 6 times a year, just shoot me an email. But Fred wanted me to draw attention to this because it's a tough year as far as the station arrangements go. Fred, I'll turn it back to you to continue the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I really wanted you to do that because I got your last newsletter and it had the best overview of that issue that I had seen anywhere. And I figured instead of trying to mimic that, I would get the real source on there. I would advise everybody to sign up and get the newsletter that he puts out. It'll keep you on top of things. The pictures here, we're doing an intercity bus study update in Ohio, and these are from our recent look at facilities. The item on the left was the note we found when we turned up in Columbus to review the Greyhound Barron's Bus Go Bus station, and found that it had moved. Events are happening fast out there on the ground. While our surveyor was in Ohio, 2 stations moved. He was there a week. And the picture on the right is the new station in Columbus. It's on the outskirts of town. It's a former gas station type facility. I think they're gonna tear down the car wash and make that into a waiting room. At any rate, the facilities that are coming online are not terribly well connected to transit. They're not central to the communities that they're in, and they're being located and chosen sometimes with only weeks notice. So it's a very difficult situation, and it keeps things moving. Kara, if you want to just put up the next slide in my sequence, you get back to where we were. I do want to say the other side of the FlixBus purchase and the ensuing changes, we are seeing new services of several types around the country. One is we're seeing new FlixBus services in a number of corridors. And the best way to keep up with those, I think, is to keep testing trips that you want to make on the FlixBus website. They do put out some press releases from time to time that cover some of it. But a lot of the new services, as far as I can see, they're basically developing the FlixBus model. They're doing point-to-point, maybe limited stops, and serving a lot of suburban stops that connect to larger urban areas or university towns. That's a generalization, but that's kind of their model and their brand. And I think the FlixBus services are going to go with that. The other side is we do see success with Section 5311F routes and services. You heard the examples from North Carolina where their program is greatly expanded. I think the Chaddock Institute had a webinar where they featured the Virginia Breeze 5311F funded network in Virginia. There are other examples around the country, and I think where the states have gotten involved and really started to look at this, they found that it's a need and that they're the appropriate agency level or operator to really try to address this need and tie together their states. Another aspect of that I think that we need to focus on going forward is is for the states to work on connecting with each other as well. I'm a little bit concerned that we do have a lot of the state services that seem to sort of, they're a wonderful thing, and then they get to the state line and they stop. And the connection is not nearly as well made or branded. And to keep that national network, we're going to have to work on that. Next slide, Kara. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, since I'm on this network jag here, and since Jonah gave me the setup by saying he'd taken his map off the National Intercity Bus Atlas, there are a number of us that have been working for years to try and get national recognition of the Intercity Bus network, in part by having an actual live, pretty up-to-date Intercity Bus Atlas. And we've got a home for it at the US DOT's Bureau of Transportation Statistics. We've got funding through the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, which chose this project through RTAP, credit to Don and his folks, to develop this National Intercity Bus Atlas and get it set up in a sustainable way. Progress has been a little bit slow. I think the industry's been distracted by COVID. And there have been some other issues, but the map is being built. And the Bureau of Transportation Statistics now has staff resources to really devote to it, to bring in the GTFS data and put the carriers on the map. And the wonderful thing about GTFS data is, yes, we can put it on the federal map that depicts the network. Planners can use it, whether they're working with private carriers or the states or whatever. But the other thing, of course, is if that data is out there, as Jonah mentioned, you can get it to Google or other sources like that. And so potential customers all over the country can discover that there's a whole network there that they can get around on by putting together the connections. I think we're looking at a goal that there'll be a National Intercity Bus Atlas along with the National Transit Map that has all of the transit map information. And we'll be able to start to see transit as a viable network for a lot of travel. So the map is underway. Many companies need to sign the memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Transportation Services and start providing their GTFS data. So there's a link there that you can jot down and reach out to those folks. Bus Atlas at RSG Inc. That's the company that's leading the NCHRP project. And their job is to work with you to get your MOU signed, help you develop the data, and work with BTS on populating the map. And I'll just show you the next slide very quickly. This is a recent screenshot to show how the map is filling in. If your company isn't in here and you've sent data, let us know so we can find out where that went and why it's not in there. And if your company, if this is all new to you and you want to have your firm represented on here, we want you. We want this network to be really, really populated. Basically, the goal is that we'd like to have the data updated quarterly. So we would have a kind of a dynamic map going through on the future. So we have Greyhound and Flixbus in here. We have a lot of regional carriers that have sent their data. The states, I have to say, are doing a great job, a lot of them, in getting GTFS data on their funded services. An issue is that their contractors, we may not have the data on the rest of the services provided by the contractor. So for example, in Michigan, we have the Michigan Flyer service. We have GTFS on that, but we don't have the rest of Indian Trails Network or even the other state-sponsored ones yet. But we're working on that. And I think there's a lot of Jefferson lines across the north central part of the country that we don't have. And I know Jefferson has GTFS data. So anyway, we'll work with you on that. I think there's one more slide with another cut of the map that shows some of the recent additions in color. And so anyway, this is a tool, but it makes the point about this being a network and the need to really work together to do that. So one more slide. Joe mentioned federal policy requires transit facilities to provide reasonable access to intercity bus lines. That's undefined, but to the extent that public entities can work with their transit providers to find a way to do this, that really makes the most sense for connectivity. The picture on the right is the transit center in Akron, Ohio, which has the intercity buses come into it. You can connect to all of the local transit. It's a clean, wonderful facility. As Joe mentioned, there are examples all over the place. We saw one from Greenville, North Carolina that I hadn't seen. If you're a state and you'd say, oh, well, this is all in urbanized areas, it's not my problem or my issue, your state-funded routes need to go to these facilities and make connections for them to be feasible. Your passengers, you don't want them waiting on a gravel lot at the edge of town because they won't ride a second time if that's where we're sending them. So you can use 5311F, 5339, other funding sources. If there's capital needs to put things into an intermodal facility where the rural transit services come into that facility, you could use the funding for operating costs, for security costs. A lot of transit systems are saying that's really their key issue. Some of that comes from the fact that you have intercity bus services that arrive in the middle of the night when the transit systems typically are not operating and you have to provide security and staffing. So, and some of it's just the bully pulpit to, let your transit operators know that this is an issue and at a state level, you think it's important to do something about. Earlier, it was mentioned we need to keep using that 5311F funding to keep the services going forward. And that includes perhaps more services than we needed to fund before in the wake of COVID. It's more of a connection planning these things because of the low frequencies and the changing routes, but really more routes than ever will need this assistance. And to the companies, I should have put another slide in here. Let me just say that if you're an intercity bus provider, if you hear from your state DOT and they want you to participate in a survey or a meeting or an interview or a consultation process, please show up and tell them what your needs are. And if your issue is that you don't want to be in a group meeting with all your competitors and talk about that, ask for an interview, a separate interview to provide that information or a survey. Your state needs to do that to put that information into those plans and into those applications and solicitations so that those services are maintained. And if the state doesn't know about it, it's it's a difficult thing for them to just imagine the needs for the intercity bus network in the same way that the carriers actually know about those needs. So anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Kai to kind of take us out and see what folks in the meeting have to say.
Hey. Thank you. I still can't share my video, Kara. Is it possible to allow me to do that? And while that's happening, I appreciate all those wonderful
I'm sorry, I don't see why you can't, but
okay.
We see your picture.
Okay, I'll get over it. Thank you everyone for those wonderful presentations. We've been monitoring the chat as it's going on and answered some of the more simple questions, and then I pulled some of the more complicated questions off to the side so that we can address them through a discussion. So the way, and also Robin Phillips from National RTAP is here to assist with facilitating this discussion. So welcome, Robin. The way I'd like for this to go is if you do have a question or a comment, can you please raise your hand and wait to be called on? That way we won't have all 75 of us trying to talk at once. And
could we answer the questions that were already put in the chat chronologically before we do that?
Yes. So the first question comes from Jay. And it says, it is sometimes difficult to get good data from competing private providers worried about proprietary information and loss of competitive advantage. Any creative suggestions?
So I'll take that one first. One of the things that we've done in our, and I don't know if we've done them in every RFP, but I know we've done it at least a couple of times before, is we allow folks to identify proprietary information. And so, and when they do that, that kind of puts up the wall, both from other people doing like public disclosure requests and things like that to kind of find out what's going on in their business. And so the key for us as a state is to make sure we tell them to say that beforehand, not when someone is coming along and asking for the public disclosure request. Go ahead, and when you're sharing information with us, just identify what information is proprietary.
Thank you, Don. Anyone else want to chime in on this one?
Hi, this is Stephanie. I think one of the things that Fred mentioned that was important is that if you're going to meet with your intercity bus providers, a group meeting is not a forum in which we're going to be able to share information readily. So surveys are great, but an actual Zoom-ish face-to-face Teams meeting of some kind is a much better way to have a discussion about what kind of information is useful and what kind of information we can provide.
That's great. Great perspective, Stephanie. Thank you. Another question from Jay. What about Justice 40 type implications this and other market realities will create? And this is in reference to the closing of intercity bus facilities. I personally am not aware of Justice 40. So if anyone's familiar with that.
Well, the issue is we can use Justice 40 measures as an example, but the issue is the same problem that intercity bus has always faced when, and I'm sure anybody who's worked in the industry for some time and tries to find locations for stations and things like that, where neighborhood associations come out and say things like, oh, we don't want those people in our neighborhood. And so intercity bus has always been geared towards the people that need it, not the people who potentially choose to ride. And so I think the question may have been rhetorical, you know, that the people who are going to suffer when intercity bus goes away are the very people who need it the most.
Well said. Yes.
Yeah, I just wonder, are there implications for FTA there that they did not see coming and will then be forced to address? And then I guess I also had a follow-up just relative to private providers now, FlixBus, et cetera. Will they be forced to respond, or, you know, why is it government's role to try to fix something that unfortunately government didn't see coming? But maybe Flix and others will have to respond to their customers' needs. Anyway, fun times.
I see Fred has his hand raised to respond here.
Yeah, I could see, I mean, when I saw the question come up, I thought, well, somebody has really kind of observed something. You know, we do a lot of compliance reviews and a lot of Title VI equity analysis kind of things. And to me, some of this certainly has a feeling that this is an issue that has certainly Title VI equity implications. I've tried to figure out, I don't see certainly the private carriers are not the issue here, but I just wonder if all of the federal money that's gone into creating a public transit facility and then a mode is excluded or asked to leave, and that mode is predominantly serving low-income minority populations, or, you know, more so maybe than the overall mix of the transit users, whether there is an issue there. Certainly, I've you know, been involved in intercity bus projects for a very long time, and you know, in many cases, I could really. It's almost stinging the difference in the reaction you'd get when you'd propose some kind of a rail project as opposed to an intercity bus project. And there's, I think, some serious issues here. I do think the bus industry has also been, in effect, the victim of providing urban spaces that were heated and cooled and had food and were open 24 hours a day in urban areas, and become a kind of a homeless shelter. And that a lot of the perceived security problems with intercity bus stations are not intercity bus passengers and are not really related to the bus service, but are in fact really, you know, the cities or the general failure to deal with homelessness and you know, related problems. And I think some of the towns that are not helping to deal with the intercity bus service will find that they have a lot of the same issues even without the bus service there. But that's just my perspective.
I think restricting supply is going to create a lot of ripple effects that we're not seeing coming. And it's directly affecting low-income people.
Yes, I would agree.
Absolutely.
Hey, I'd like to go back just to one point. I think that there was one comment about why doesn't the private sector address it? And because they won't make money on it, you know, and that's why it switches over to government to try to step in and help in these cases. We can choose as different state governments not to invest, but it means people will suffer. You know, and so that's why it needs to be done in partnership between government and the private sector.
And I was responding to, it seems like they just shed all those responsibilities. They saw an opportunity to do so possibly. And yet, FlixBus and others that are trying to streamline things may find that it does erode their market share, ultimately.
Yeah, this is Joe. I'll add a comment. That's a good point. I think one thing we have noticed or heard from people in the industry is that we're kind of alone in the US for having privately run bus stations. So a company like FlixBus is not accustomed to that. We're around the country, around the world, they use public facilities. And then to echo something Fred said, that is a real hang up in a lot of cities where a politician stands up and say, we are not going to subsidize a private business. They should pay their fair share. and it kind of misses the essential element. I think, as Don pointed out, that there just isn't money in the intercity bus industry to pay for a terminal with property tax that goes with it. We found some stations are paying upward of 80, 100,000 a year just in property tax. So the business model really has changed, and you raised some good points.
We have a lot of questions and about 10 more minutes. So maybe we can go on to some of the other questions that were in the chat.
Yep. So we have a question from David. In the large communities where Greyhound has lost their station, what are they doing? Where are they unloading?
This is Joe. Do you want me to chime in on that one, or?
Yeah,
Sure. It really varies by town. And I think in the smaller towns, the first stop is often a transit hub. That's proven unworkable in some cities like Knoxville, Tennessee. Greyhound's gone to, convenience stores and things like that. Then that creates other problems. There's not waiting rooms. So it's just a mixed bag out there. And, thankfully, we point out that some states have gotten ahead of this. Atlanta just opened a new station, I believe, with Georgia Transportation Department support. So they have created really a model for other states that this can be part of a larger state transportation plan. But it's kind of a Wild West environment out there. And every week we have a new story. Some bad, some acceptable, you might say.
Thanks, Joe. Ben, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, good afternoon, folks. A quick question for the WashDOT folks still on the call. There was a mention of grant funding versus service contracts. Could you speak about that a bit more, please?
Yeah, sure. And feel free to leave me with some questions. So the upshot is that with contracting, the state has a lot more control about where the service goes. I mean, I suppose you could change that up with a grant and say you're awarding a grant for a singular route at a single time. But we found to do it through an RFP and contracting role is a lot more effective way to make sure that the network as a whole works, and that we're able to show where the connections are made, the meaningful timed connections are, and require interlining, things like that, all things that kind of make the system work. Does that get at your question, or was there something more specific that you were wondering?
I guess there's been some confusion occasionally on our end of the implications of doing, traditional sort of grant subaward agreements versus having a services contract, and how the FTA looks at that.
And it's just my personal preference, although you can tell I feel pretty strongly about it. If you're asking about what you're allowed to do, you're allowed to do either. I just have strong feelings that going through the contracting model, again, makes the system work better, whereas a traditional grant model, you're really relying on the grantee to describe what they're going to do and the connections that they're going to make.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, John, I'm feeling you want to go back to the previous question. And
yeah, is it my turn?
let's see, Fred, are you going to stay on this question for a second?
I was just going to stay on the grants versus contracts for.
Okay, quickly, Fred, and then we're going to go to John to go back to the next.
Okay, if you look at the FTA circular on third-party contracting and who's potentially a grant recipient and who's potentially a third-party contractor, private nonprofits are potentially grant recipients, as are public entities. Third party, a subrecipient is not a private for-profit. Now, a number of states have tried to split the difference between the models that Don is describing for a contracted environment with something that's more like a grant, because they're used to administering grants. And they'll do something that they call it either a competitive grant solicitation, And in the grant solicitation, you define the scope of services that you're providing a grant to operate buses between A, B, and C. And you want those buses to be daily. To me, the big issue for a state, though, is to figure out what kind of compliance oversight you want to do on this entity. Do you want to get involved in making sure that bus company X that you gave the contract to is doing all of its purchasing in line with federal procurement requirements? Do you want to follow their line item budget every month to make sure that they're spending appropriate amounts and that they're procuring it the right way? Or if you're doing it in a contract way, you could be paying them per bus mile with all of the costs rolled up, and you know what you're buying. There's a difference in the oversight and the compliance requirements that's really related to those things. And that's something, you can get into the federal regs, and it's very, very confusing. But to me, that's a key difference. In addition to being able to use the RFP for a contract to very specifically define what it is you want to buy, which is what Don's point was. And that's really originally why Washington State got involved with it. I'd say the other thing is it's much harder to get rid of a grant recipient who's a non-performer as well.
So Fred, let's,
and a lot of,
just in the name of time, let's
so that's the end of that. Yeah.
probably have to have a whole webinar on that topic alone.
Well, that's going to be one of our questions. What webinars do you want? I want to hear what John Baranowski is going to ask.
Yeah, we're gonna go John, and then we're gonna go Jonah, the question for Jonah, and then we're gonna wrap this up.
Well, yeah, thanks, everybody. And Fred, your presentation was excellent, not to detract from the others, Joe, and everybody. I think you summed the whole thing up pretty well. My name's John Baranowski. I've got 33 years in the bus business up until last April. Now I work for Transcore Data Services as their Chief Commercial Officer. This thing, I was directly involved with station relocation, and the previous speaker summed it up very well. Flix bought a bus company, but they didn't buy the stations. And that's really caused quite an issue. I think most of the problems with that have been addressed, and they are substantial. I'll say a couple of these things. There's just blame all around on this thing. It's very frustrating. But when you're operating a network type of business, the way Greyhound always has, and Flix is also, on-time performance is extremely important. You just simply cannot run a bus company with 60% on-time performance without really causing stresses for the landlord. So many times we would find a new place that was semi-suitable to operate, but Greyhound bus comes in 4 hours late, the other bus had to leave, and now you have an angry person who's hanging around this business, this transit agency. And it's just something that the landlord didn't sign up for, and that's just caused this incredible turnaround. I'm not quite sure how to address that, except maybe just a better focus for all the carriers on time performance. The other thing is that this is a bit self-inflicted on Greyhound Flix's side, but in the past, if you had a broken connection like I described, you could usually have that resolved at the counter by a ticket agent, just like you would at the airport. Or you could call an 800 number and they would fix it too. So both options were available. But Flix is a bit Eurocentric on this. They want to be very modern and that kind of thing. And that unfortunately, the tools that Greyhound people had prior to February 23rd no longer exist. So when there's a broken connection, they're forced to call an 800 number, and that's just never as good as a face thing. Finally, just to re-emphasize, one of the things I find most distressing about the whole topic is, yes, all these public facilities, many are quite suitable for intercity bus. For one reason or another, intercity bus was denied. It could be related to our on-time performance. We leave people hanging around. Each of the markets is local. The reasons are always different. but these are public monies and whatever anybody on this call can do to ensure that Intercity Bus could get into these often wonderful facilities, that's time well spent. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate the insight, John. So last question.
Yeah, we're at the top of the hour, really, and there has been so much great information sharing. I think we could go on for 10 hours and still not be finished. Thanks to our fabulous panel who really touched on so many things. As you know, we started out in the presentation, it's all about change, and that's what we learned. And I think, as Robin said, if you want to join an in-person Intercity Bus Roundtable at the FTA programs meeting, you can talk about it more. And at our National RTAP Technical Assistance Conference in December 3rd through 6th, 2023 in Myrtle Beach, California, we'll have an additional Intercity Bus Roundtable. And we'll have a lot more of these online roundtables too. So keep those thoughts coming. We will post a recording and a presentation and a question and answer document within about a week of today, and we'll let everybody who attended know. Thank you to our great panelists, and thank you to our audience.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.